The wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth as Clara Hensley stepped off the stagecoach, her boots sinking into the muddy main street of Willow Creek. Her heart pounded, not from the journey across the rugged Montana territory, but from the letter clutched in her gloved hand, a promise of a new life, a husband, a home. At 30, Clara was no stranger to rejection, her plain features and sharp tongue earning her little favor in the polished parlors of Boston. But here in this frontier town, cradled by jagged mountains and whispering forests, she dared to hope for a different story. The townsfolk of Willow Creek cast curious glances her way, their eyes lingering on her worn traveling dress and the stubborn set of her jaw. She scanned the small crowd for Elias Thornton, the man whose letters had painted dreams of a shared life. His words had been kind practical, promising a partnership built on mutual respect. But as she stood alone, the autumn chill creeping through her shawl, a man approached, not with warmth, but with a frown that carved lines into his weathered face. "You, Clara Hensley?" he asked, his voice gruff. She nodded, her throat tight. "I'm Elias Thornton. I reckon there's been a mistake. I was expecting someone different." His gaze flickered over her dismissive before landing on the horizon. "I can't take a wife who don't fit the picture I had in mind." The words struck like a slap, though Clara's face remained stone. She'd heard worse, her father's scorn, the whispers of Boston's elite. But this betrayal, after months of letters and a cross-country journey, cut deeper. "I see," she said, her voice steady, despite the ache in her chest. "Then I'll trouble you no further, Mr. Thornton." She turned her bag heavy in her hand and walked toward the boarding house at the edge of town. The mountains loomed, their peaks dusted with early snow, and the river's murmur seemed to mock her. She'd come to Willow Creek for a husband, but found only another door slammed shut. Yet Clara Hensley was no stranger to forging her own path. She'd find a way to survive here, husband or not. Inside the boarding house, she met Mrs. Abigail Carter, a wiry woman with kind eyes and a knack for gossip. "Don't you mind, Elias?" Abigail said, pouring Clara a cup of coffee that smelled of chicory and comfort. "He's got a fool's notion of what a wife should be. You're better off without him." Clara forced a smile, but her mind churned. She had no money to return to Boston, no family to claim her. Willow Creek was her home now, whether it welcomed her or not. As night fell, Clara stood at her window, the stars sharp against the velvet sky. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a man leading a horse along the riverbank, his silhouette broad and steady. She didn't know it then, but that man, Samuel Reed, would change everything. For now, she closed the curtain, her resolve hardening like the frost on the glass. She'd build a life here one way or another. The morning sun spilled golden light over Willow Creek, painting the frost-kissed meadows in hues of amber and rose. Clara awoke to the scent of bacon and the clatter of pans from Abigail's kitchen, but her heart was heavy with the weight of yesterday's rejection. She stood before the cracked mirror in her boarding house room, studying her reflection. Brown eyes too fierce for beauty, a scattering of freckles across her nose, hair the color of chestnut bark pinned tightly at her nape. "You're enough," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. She'd come to this town seeking a husband, but now she needed something more, a purpose. Downstairs, Abigail thrust a broom into Clara's hands. "No rent if you help with chores," she said, her tone brisk but warm. Clara swept the porch, her movements sharp and deliberate, as if she could sweep away Elias Thornton's dismissal. The townsfolk bustled past, their whispers, trailing like leaves in the wind. "That's the girl." Elias turned away. One woman muttered, her bonnet shielding her face. "Too plain for his liking, I reckon." Clara's grip tightened on the broom, but she kept her chin high. She'd faced worse than gossip in Boston's drawing rooms, where her merchant father's disgrace had branded her an outcast. By noon, Clara ventured into town, her boots crunching on the gravel path. Willow Creek was small but alive, its main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith's forge, and a whitewashed church. The river ran alongside its waters, sparkling under the sun, and the mountain stood sentinel in the distance. She stopped at the general store, hoping to find work. The owner, Mr. Grayson, a man with a face like crumpled parchment, shook his head. "Ain't got no jobs for a woman like you," he said, his eyes sliding past her to a younger, fairer customer. Clara bit back a retort and left her resolve wavering but unbroken. As she walked along the riverbank, the scent of wet earth grounding her, she noticed a man kneeling by a broken fence, his hands deftly mending the wood. It was the same figure she'd seen last night, broad-shouldered with dark hair curling beneath a worn hat. He looked up, his eyes a warm hazel, and offered a nod. "You're new here," he said, his voice low and steady like the river itself. "I'm Samuel Reed. Own a small spread just outside town." "Clara Hensley," she replied, surprised by the lack of judgment in his gaze. "I'm staying at the boarding house for now." He stood wiping his hands on his trousers. "Heard about Thornton. He's a fool to judge a book by its cover." His words were matter of fact, but they stirred something in Clara, hope perhaps, or the faint promise of understanding. Samuel gestured to the fence. "This land's part of the community pasture. I keep it up, help folks graze their stock." "You good with your hands, I can learn," Clara said, her voice firm. She'd spent years managing her father's accounts. She wasn't afraid of hard work. Samuel handed her a hammer, his calloused fingers brushing hers. "Let's see what you've got then." For the next hour they worked side by side, the rhythm of hammer and nail steadying Clara's nerves. Samuel didn't pry, but his quiet presence felt like a balm. He spoke of Willow Creek, its stubborn soil, its tight-knit families, its prejudices. "Folks here don't take kindly to outsiders," he said, "but they come around if you prove your worth." As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the river, Clara drove the final nail into the fence. Her hands ached, but her spirit felt lighter. Samuel studied their work, then her. "You've got grit, Clara Hensley. Don't let this town tell you otherwise." His words lingered warm as the fading light, and for the first time since arriving, Clara felt seen. The air was crisp with the tang of autumn leaves as Clara walked back to the boarding house, her hands still tingling from the weight of the hammer. Samuel's words, "You've got grit," echoed in her mind, a small spark in the shadow of Elias Thornton's rejection. She could still see the pity in the townsfolk's eyes, hear their whispers about the spinster who'd come all the way from Boston only to be cast aside. But as the river's gentle rush filled the evening air, Clara felt a stubborn resolve take root. She'd make a place for herself in Willow Creek, not as someone's wife, but as herself. At the boarding house, Abigail was kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. "You've got dirt on your cheek, girl," she said, grinning. "Been rolling in the mud or working miracles?" Clara laughed, a sound that surprised her, and recounted her afternoon with Samuel. Abigail's eyes twinkled. "Samuel Reed's a good man. Lost his wife 3 years back to fever. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's got a heart bigger than these mountains." Clara nodded, storing the information away. She didn't dare hope for more than kindness from Samuel, not yet, but his steady presence had already carved a small space in her thoughts. That night she wrote in her journal, the candlelight flickering across the page. "I came here for a husband, but perhaps I'll find something better, a life I choose." The next morning, Clara returned to the community pasture, determined to prove her worth. Samuel was there splitting wood with an axe that gleamed in the sunlight. "Back for more?" he asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She nodded, rolling up her sleeves. They worked together, repairing another section of the fence, their conversation easy but guarded. Samuel spoke of the land, its harsh winters, its fertile springs, and Clara shared snippets of her past, careful not to linger on her father's ruin or the suitors who'd scorned her for her plainness. As they worked, a woman approached, her auburn curls bouncing under a bonnet trimmed with lace. She was beautiful, with porcelain skin and a smile that seemed practiced. "Samuel Reed, you're a sight for sore eyes," she called, her voice honeyed. Clara's stomach tightened as the woman's gaze flicked to her, dismissive. "And who's this Clara Hensley? Meet Lydia Harper." Samuel said, his tone neutral. "Lydia's family owns the biggest ranch in Willow Creek." Lydia's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, the mail-order bride. Pity about Elias." Her words were sharp, meant to wound, and Clara felt the old sting of being judged. But she straightened, meeting Lydia's gaze. "I'm no one's pity, Miss Harper. I'm here to stay." Lydia's laugh was light, but her eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that." She turned to Samuel, her hand brushing his arm. "You'll be at the harvest dance, won't you? I saved you a spot on my card." Samuel nodded, but his expression was unreadable. As Lydia sauntered away, Clara drove a nail into the fence with more force than necessary. "Don't mind her," Samuel said, his voice low. "Lydia's used to getting her way. She and I, We were close once, but that's long past. Clara nodded, unsure why his words eased the knot in her chest. They worked in silence until the sun hung low, its light gilding the river. Samuel handed her a canteen, their fingers brushing again, and Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing to the fence. "Better than most men in town. You've got a place here, Clara, if you want it." His words were simple, but they landed like a promise. As she walked back to town, the mountains glowing purple in the dusk, Clara felt a flicker of something new hope, not just for survival, but for belonging. The harvest moon hung low over Willow Creek, casting a silver glow across the valley as Clara stepped into the town hall, her heart a drumbeat in her chest. The air was thick with the scent of apple cider and beeswax candles, and fiddles sang a lively tune that made the wooden floor hum. She'd hesitated to attend the harvest dance, knowing the townsfolk's eyes would follow her, their whispers sharp as thorns. But Abigail had insisted, pressing a borrowed dress of soft blue muslin into her hands. "Show 'em you're not broken," she'd said, and Clara, with her chin high and her fears tucked away, had agreed. The hall was a whirl of color, women in calico and men in pressed shirts, their laughter mingling with the music. Clara stood near the door, her hands smoothing the unfamiliar dress, feeling like an outsider, in a world that seemed to belong to everyone else. She spotted Elias Thornton across the room, his arm around a giggling young woman with golden curls. His rejection still stung, but Clara forced her gaze away, determined not to let him steal this night. Then she saw Samuel leaning against a beam, his hazel eyes catching the candlelight. He wore a clean shirt, his dark hair tamed, but still curling at the edges, and something about his quiet strength made Clara's breath catch. He saw her and crossed the room, his stride sure. "You clean up well, Clara Hensley," he said, a half smile softening his rugged features. "Care to dance?" Her heart leapt, but doubt crept in. She wasn't graceful, not like Lydia Harper, who was already twirling with a rancher, her laughter drawing every eye. "I'm no dancer," Clara admitted, her voice low. Samuel's smile widened. "Neither am I. Let's make a mess of it together." Before she could protest, he took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers, and led her to the floor. The music slowed a waltz, weaving through the air like a river's current. Samuel's hand rested lightly on her waist, guiding her with a steadiness that made her forget the watching crowd. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. For the first time in years, Clara felt seen not as a merchant's disgraced daughter or a rejected bride, but as herself, whole and enough. Their dance was interrupted by Lydia's voice, sharp and sweet. "Samuel, you promised me this one," she said, her smile ablade. Samuel hesitated, his hand still on Clara's waist, but politeness won. "Next one's yours." "Clara," he said, his eyes holding hers for a moment before he stepped away. Clara retreated to the sidelines, her heart a tangle of warmth and unease, as she watched Lydia glide into Samuel's arms, her beauty a stark contrast to Clara's plainness. Abigail appeared at her side, offering a cup of cider. "Don't let Lydia rattle you," she whispered. "She's got her claws out, but Samuel's no fool." Clara nodded, sipping the cider, its tartness grounding her. She watched Samuel and Lydia, noting the distance in his posture, the way his eyes strayed to the edge of the room toward her. It was a small thing, but it kindled a spark of courage. As the song ended, Clara made a decision. She wouldn't hide in the shadows, not tonight. She approached Samuel before Lydia could claim him again, her voice steady. "You owe me that dance, Mr. Reed." His grin was immediate, warm as the candlelight, and he took her hand without a word. This time, as they moved together, Clara felt the weight of Willow Creek's judgment lift, if only for a moment. The music, the warmth of his touch, the rustle of her dress against the floor. It was a promise that she could belong here if she fought for it. The dawn broke over Willow Creek with a hush, the mountains cloaked in mist that curled like smoke from a dying fire. Clara stood on the boarding house porch, her breath visible in the chill, replaying the harvest dance in her mind. Samuel's hand on her waist, the way his eyes had held hers, the fleeting sense that she was more than the sum of her rejections, it lingered like the scent of cider on her skin. But doubt gnawed at her, whispering that a man like Samuel, steady and respected, could never see her as more than a friend. Not when women like Lydia Harper cast such long shadows. She shook off the thought and headed to the community pasture, where Samuel had promised to teach her to mend a harness. Work she'd learned was a balm for uncertainty. The pasture was quiet, the river's murmur blending with the soft lowing of cattle. Samuel was already there, his sleeves rolled up a leather strap draped over a fence post. Morning, he called, his voice warm but guarded, as if he too was wrestling with unspoken thoughts. Ready to get your hands dirty? Clara nodded, tying an apron over her dress. As they worked, the rhythm of their task, cutting, leather stitching seams, felt like an extension of their dance, a quiet partnership. Samuel explained each step with patience, his hands steady as he guided hers. You're a quick study, he said, his tone approving. Most folks here don't bother learning this. They'd rather buy new than fix old. I've never had the luxury of throwing things away, Clara replied, her voice softer than she intended. She glanced at him, catching a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He didn't press, but she sensed he knew what it was to salvage something broken, to make it whole again. Their work was interrupted by the clatter of hooves. Elias Thornton rode up, his posture stiff, his eyes narrowing, as he took in Clara's presence. Reed, you're wasting time with this one, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. She ain't worth the effort. Clara's hands stilled the sting of his words, sharper in Samuel's presence. Before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward, his voice low but firm. Mind your tongue, Thornton. Clara's worth more than you'll ever know. Elias snorted, but something in Samuel's stance, unyielding, protective, made him back off. He spurred his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and tension. Clara's throat tightened, not from Elias's cruelty, but from Samuel's defense. You didn't have to do that, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to, Samuel replied, his eyes meeting hers. You don't deserve his nonsense, or this town's. The weight of his words settled over her, warm as the sun breaking through the mist. For a moment they stood there, the harness forgotten, the air between them charged with something unspoken. Their moment was broken by a shout from the riverbank. A young boy, one of the town's children, was caught in the current, his arms flailing. Without a word, Samuel sprinted toward the water, Clara close behind. The river was cold, its pull fierce, but Samuel waded in his strength, hauling the boy to safety. Clara helped drag the child to the bank, her skirts heavy with water, her heart racing. The boy's mother, a woman named Mary, rushed over, tears streaming as she clutched her son. Thank you, she sobbed, looking from Samuel to Clara. Both of you. As the crowd dispersed, Clara shivered, her wet dress clinging to her skin. Samuel draped his coat over her shoulders, its warmth smelling of leather and pine. You didn't hesitate, he said, his voice low with admiration. Most would have stood by and watched. Most haven't had to fight for everything, Clara replied, meeting his gaze. In that moment, under the weight of his coat and the memory of his defense, she felt a connection deeper than friendship, a spark of something that could grow if she let it. The scent of wood smoke and fresh-baked bread hung over Willow Creek. As Clara walked through town, Samuel's coat still warm around her shoulders. The river rescue had spread like wildfire, and for the first time the townsfolk's glances held something new. Curiosity, even respect instead of pity. But Clara knew better than to trust fleeting approval. She'd learned in Boston that acceptance could vanish as quickly as morning dew, especially for a woman who didn't fit the mold. Still, the memory of Samuel's steady gaze, his quiet defense against Elias, burned brighter than the autumn sun. She returned to the boarding house where Abigail was waiting with a knowing smile. You're the talk of the town, girl, she said, stirring a pot of stew that filled the kitchen with the savory aroma of onions and thyme. Saving little Tommy like that, you and Samuel are heroes. Clara brushed off the praise, her cheeks warming. I just did what needed doing, she said. But Abigail's raised eyebrow suggested she saw more. Perhaps the spark between Clara and Samuel that Clara was only beginning to acknowledge. Determined to carve out her place, Clara sought work beyond the boarding house. She approached the church where Reverend Polk, a kindly man with wire-rimmed spectacles, needed help organizing the winter charity drive. We could use someone with a sharp mind, he said, peering at her over his glasses. You're not afraid to speak up, are you? Clara smiled, sensing an ally. No, sir. I've had to speak for myself plenty. She threw herself into the work, sorting donations and planning distributions, her days filled with purpose. But the whispers persisted. At the general store, she overheard Lydia Harper's voice, sharp as a blade. She's fooling herself, thinking she can belong here. Samuel's just being kind. The words stung, but Clara kept her head high, refusing to let Lydia's venom take root. She'd fought too hard to let jealousy undo her. One crisp afternoon, as she carried a basket of blankets to the church, Samuel appeared leading a horse laden with sacks of grain. Thought the charity drive could use these, he said, his voice warm but hesitant. Mind if I walk with you? Clara nodded, her heart quickening. The path wound along the river, its surface glinting like polished glass, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. They talked easily about the land the coming winter, the stubborn hope that kept Willow Creek alive. Samuel shared more of his past, his wife's death, the loneliness that had settled into his bones. I thought I'd never want to care again, he admitted, his eyes on the horizon. But then you showed up, Clara, with your fire and your grit. His words hung between them, heavy with meaning, and Clara's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him to bridge the gap, but fear held her back, fear of rejection, fear of hoping too much. As they reached the church, a commotion erupted. Lydia stood at the steps, her face flushed, accusing Clara of mismanaging the charity donations. She's an outsider, Lydia said, her voice carrying to the gathering crowd. How do we trust her with our goods? The accusation was baseless, but it stung, echoing Clara's deepest insecurities. Before she could respond, Samuel stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. Clara's done more for this town in a week than you have in a year, Lydia. You want to talk trust, look at her work, not your spite. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others averting their eyes. Lydia's face reddened, but she stormed off, her bonnet bouncing with each step. Clara's heart pounded, not from the confrontation, but from Samuel's unwavering support. As the crowd dispersed, he turned to her, his expression soft. You don't have to fight alone, Clara. Not here. His hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that felt like a vow. In that moment, with the river singing and the mountains watching, Clara dared to believe she could build something lasting, not just a home, but a heart's true haven. The first snow dusted Willow Creek like powdered sugar, softening the edges of the mountains and blanketing the town in a quiet hush. Clara stood at the church steps, her breath clouding in the frosty air as she handed out blankets to families preparing for winter. The charity drive had grown under her care, with more donations than Reverend Polk had seen in years. Her hands were chapped, her back ached, but the gratitude in the townsfolk's eyes, once skeptical, now warm, made every effort worthwhile. Yet beneath her pride, a question lingered. Could she truly belong here? Or was she still just the outsider who'd arrived with a broken dream? Samuel had been a constant presence, delivering supplies or lending a hand at the church. His quiet support steadied her, but their moments together, brief touches, shared glances, left her heart in a tangle. She wanted to trust the warmth in his eyes, but the scars of rejection ran deep. What if she was misreading him? What if Lydia's whispered barbs were right and Samuel's kindness was just pity? That afternoon, as Clara sorted canned goods in the church basement, the door creaked open and Lydia Harper stepped inside. Her auburn curls were tucked under a fur-lined hood, and her smile was sharp as the icicles hanging outside. You've been busy, Lydia said, her tone deceptively sweet. Playing the saint, are we? Or is this all to catch Samuel's eye? Clara's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice even. I'm here to help, Lydia, not to play games. Lydia's laugh was cold. You think you can waltz into Willow Creek and take what's mine? Samuel and I have history. He'll come back to me once he sees you for what you are, a plain nobody with nothing to offer. The words cut, echoing Clara's old fears, but she stood taller, her hands steady on a jar of peaches. If Samuel's yours, he'll choose you. But I'm not here to compete. I'm here to live. Lydia's eyes flashed, but before she could retort, Samuel's voice cut through the chill. Enough, Lydia. He stood in the doorway, his face shadowed, but his tone firm. Clara's worth isn't up for debate. And you and I, that's long over. You know it. Lydia's composure cracked, her lips trembling before she stormed out, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Samuel stepped closer, his boots scuffing the wooden floor. I'm sorry you had to hear that, he said, his hazel eyes searching hers. Lydia's got a way of twisting things. Clara nodded, her throat tight. She's not wrong about one thing, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm plain. I've never been the woman men choose. Samuel's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, his touch warm despite the cold. You're wrong, Clara. You're strong, kind, and more beautiful than you know, not because of how you look, but because of who you are. I see you, and I choose you." His words were a quiet thunder shaking the walls she'd built around her heart. For a moment they stood there, hands clasped, the world narrowing to the space between them. Before Clara could respond, a shout echoed from outside. A barn on the edge of town had caught fire, the flames licking the snowy sky. Samuel and Clara ran toward the blaze, joining the townsfolk in a frantic bucket brigade. The air smelled of smoke and desperation, but Clara worked tirelessly, passing water alongside Samuel, their movements synchronized. When the fire was finally out, the barn reduced to smoldering timbers, the crowd cheered, and Clara felt a shift. Willow Creek was beginning to see her as one of their own. As the snow fell harder, Samuel pulled her aside, his breath visible in the cold. "You're changing this town, Clara. And you're changing me." His words soft as the snow landed like a promise. For the first time, Clara let herself believe that love real, equal, enduring might be hers. The snow fell thicker now, blanketing Willow Creek in a silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the distant call of a winter bird. Clara stood by the river, its edges crusted with ice, her heart still racing from Samuel's words the night before, "I choose you." They echoed through her warm as the memory of his hand in hers, but doubt lingered like frost on her skin. She'd spent so long guarding herself against rejection that trust felt like stepping onto thin ice, thrilling and terrifying all at once. The town's growing acceptance was a comfort, but could she truly open her heart to Samuel and risk it breaking again? Back at the boarding house, Abigail noticed the flush in Clara's cheeks. "You've got that look," she said, her eyes twinkling over a steaming pot of coffee, like a woman who's finally seeing what's right in front of her. Clara smiled, stirring her cup, the rich aroma grounding her. "Samuel's different," she admitted. "But I'm scared, Abigail. What if I let myself believe in him and it falls apart?" Abigail's face softened. "Love's a risk, girl, but Samuel Reed's worth betting on. He's been through his own pain, losing his wife, carrying that grief alone. If he's opening up to you, it's because he sees something real." Clara nodded, her resolve strengthening. She'd faced worse fears than this: her father's ruin, Boston's scorn, Elias's rejection. She could face this too. Determined to contribute more to Willow Creek, Clara proposed a bold idea to Reverend Polk: a community schoolhouse not just for children, but for adults eager to learn reading, writing, or practical skills. This town could use a place to grow together, she said, her voice steady despite the audacity of her plan. The Reverend agreed, and soon Clara was organizing volunteers, her days filled with meetings and plans. Samuel was her first supporter, offering to donate lumber from his land. "You're building more than a schoolhouse," he told her, his voice warm with pride. "You're building a future." But not everyone welcomed her efforts. At a town meeting to discuss the schoolhouse, Lydia Harper stood, her voice dripping with false concern. "A school's a fine idea, but why trust an outsider to lead it? She's been here barely a month. What does she know about our needs?" The room stirred some nodding in agreement, and Clara felt the old sting of being judged. Before she could speak, Samuel rose, his presence commanding silence. "Clara's done more for Willow Creek than most born here," he said. "She saved a child, fought a fire, and organized the charity drive. If that's not knowing our needs, I don't know what is." His words shifted the room's mood, and the vote passed in favor of the schoolhouse. Lydia's face soured, but Clara felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Samuel's defense, but for the townsfolk who'd begun to see her worth. As the meeting ended, Samuel walked her home, the snow crunching under their boots. The air smelled of pine and promise, and the mountains glowed under the moonlight. "You didn't have to speak up for me," Clara said, her voice soft. "But I'm glad you did." Samuel stopped, turning to face her. "I'll always speak up for you, Clara. Not because you need it, but because I believe in you." His hand found hers, his touch steady despite the cold. "I'm falling for you, and I don't say that lightly. I want a life with you if you'll have me." The words hung between them, as fragile and beautiful as the snowflakes catching in her hair. Clara's heart pounded, her fears battling her longing. She wanted to say yes, to leap into this new possibility, but the weight of her past held her back. Before she could answer, a cry pierced the night, a child's voice lost in the snow. Clara and Samuel ran toward the sound, finding a girl from the charity drive, shivering and disoriented. Together they brought her to safety, their teamwork seamless. As they warmed the child by Abigail's fire, Clara looked at Samuel. His face softened by concern, and knew her answer was already forming. The wind howled through Willow Creek, rattling the boarding house windows as Clara sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to quiet the storm in her heart. Samuel's confession, "I'm falling for you," had left her breathless, teetering on the edge of hope and fear. She'd spent years building walls against rejection, each scar from Boston's disdain and Elias's dismissal a brick in her defenses. But Samuel's steady gaze, his unwavering support, chipped away at those walls, leaving her vulnerable yet alive in a way she hadn't felt before. The girl they'd rescued last night was safe now, tucked into bed at home. But Clara's thoughts lingered on the moment she and Samuel had worked as one, their hearts aligned in purpose. Morning brought a fresh layer of snow sparkling under a pale sun. Clara bundled up and headed to the site of the new schoolhouse, where volunteers were raising the frame. The air smelled of sawdust and possibility, and the rhythmic thud of hammers echoed like a heartbeat. Samuel was there, hauling beams with the other men, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. He caught her eye and smiled, a quiet promise that made her pulse quicken. She joined the effort, organizing supplies and directing workers, her voice clear, despite the knot in her chest. As the day wore on, trouble brewed. Elias Thornton arrived, his face a mask of scorn, flanked by a few ranchers who shared his distrust of outsiders. "This schoolhouse is a waste," he declared loud enough for all to hear. "We don't need some city woman telling us how to live. She'll be gone by spring, mark my words." The words stung, but Clara had faced worse. She stepped forward, her boots sinking into the snow, her voice steady. "I'm not here to tell you how to live, Mr. Thornton. I'm here to help this town grow. If you don't want that, you're welcome to leave." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in approval, others shifting uncomfortably. Before Elias could retort, Lydia appeared, her eyes glinting with malice. "She's right, Elias," she said, her tone deceptively sweet. "Let her build her little school. It'll fail and she'll leave, and we'll all be better for it." The crowd hushed, sensing the challenge. Clara's hands clenched, but Samuel stepped to her side, his presence a shield. "This school's for all of us," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Clara's proven her heart. If you can't see that you're the ones who don't belong." The standoff hung heavy, the wind whistling through the half-built frame. Then Reverend Polk spoke up, his gentle authority cutting through the tension. "Clara's given us more than most. Let's finish this work together." Slowly the crowd dispersed, some casting apologetic glances at Clara. Elias and Lydia left their defeat evident in their stiff strides. Clara exhaled, her breath clouding in the cold, and turned to Samuel. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He took her hand, leading her away from the site to a quiet spot by the river, its icy edges glinting in the sunlight. "You don't need to thank me," he said, his hazel eyes searching hers. "You're stronger than this town knows. But I meant what I said last night, Clara. I want you in my life, not just as a friend, but as my partner, my equal. Will you let me love you?" His words were a beacon piercing the fog of her doubts. She thought of her past, of the rejections, the loneliness, and then of the future she could build with him, one rooted in respect and shared dreams. Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled, her voice steady. "Yes, Samuel, I want that too." He pulled her close, his arms warm and sure, and for the first time Clara felt truly home. The river sang, the mountains stood watch, and the snow fell softly, sealing their promise. But the fight for the schoolhouse and her place in Willow Creek was far from over. The first light of spring crept over Willow Creek, melting the snow into rivulets that fed the river's joyful rush. Clara stood before the newly finished schoolhouse, its fresh pine walls gleaming under the morning sun, a testament to months of toil and triumph. The air carried the scent of budding wildflowers and damp earth, and the mountains, no longer cloaked in white, stood proud against a sky of endless blue. Inside, the schoolhouse buzzed with life. Children's laughter, adults murmuring over primers, the scratch of chalk on slates. Clara's heart swelled. This was her legacy, a place where Willow Creek could grow together, where she'd proven her worth not just to the town, but to herself. The past months had tested her resolve. Elias Thornton's opposition had faded after the confrontation at the schoolhouse site, but Lydia Harper's subtle barbs persisted, whispered in the general store or at church suppers. Yet Clara's work teaching reading to minors, arithmetic to farmers, and sewing to young girls had won over even the skeptics. The townsfolk now greeted her with smiles, their gratitude evident in the baskets of apples or knitted scarves left at the boarding house. Abigail, her fiercest ally, had taken to calling her the Heart of Willow Creek, a title Clara wore quietly but proudly. Samuel had been her rock, his love, a steady flame through the winter's chill. Their bond had deepened, built on late-night talks by the fire-shared laughter over burnt biscuits and quiet moments by the river, where words weren't needed. He'd proposed properly one frosty evening, kneeling in the snow with a simple ring he'd carved from cedar, its grain as warm as his heart. "Marry me, Clara," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "Let's build a life not just for us, but for this town." She'd said yes, her fears finally silenced by the certainty of his love. But today, as the schoolhouse opened its doors for its first official day, a final challenge loomed. Lydia Harper had rallied a small group to protest, claiming the school diverted resources from the church. Clara stood at the schoolhouse steps, her blue muslin dress catching the breeze as Lydia approached, her voice loud enough to draw a crowd. "This school's a mistake," she declared. "It's tearing us apart, led by a woman who doesn't belong." The words were a final stab meant to unravel everything Clara had built. Before Clara could respond, Samuel stepped forward, his hand finding hers, their fingers interlocking like the roots of an ancient tree. "This school's brought us together," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Clara's given us hope, a place to learn to grow. If you can't see that, Lydia, you're the one tearing us apart." The crowd nodded, some clapping, and Reverend Polk added, "This school is God's work, and Clara's his instrument." Even Elias Thornton, standing at the edge, remained silent, his fight long spent. Lydia's face crumpled, her defiance crumbling under the town's unity. She turned and left, her steps heavy with defeat. Clara squeezed Samuel's hand, her heart full. The schoolhouse doors opened and children streamed in their voices, a chorus of possibility. Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Clara and Samuel stood by the river, its waters sparkling like their future. They'd marry in the church come summer, their vows a promise to each other and to Willow Creek, a commitment to love, equality, and a community made stronger by their shared vision. As the stars began to wink above the mountains, Clara felt whole, her past scars, no longer wounds but badges of her resilience. She'd come to Willow Creek seeking a husband, but found a home, a purpose, and a love that saw her for all she was. Samuel kissed her forehead, his breath warm against her skin, and she knew this was only the beginning. If you love this story of resilience and love overcoming prejudice, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to explore more.